I worked just shy of 40 years, but my pension still wasn't going to be enough for us. So when he called out of the blue, offering a free pension review, I was all ears. He spoke professionally about investments. He seemed a really decent guy. Just shy of 40 years pension. He took all of it.
Coming up in this hour, Peter Hitchens joins us. He's been having a weekend of batting away hysterical lefties who took exception to his column in the Mail on Sunday, in which he basically said, never mind the Taliban in Afghanistan, never mind the women and the way that they've been treated there. What about the women back here and how they've been treated by the lefty liberal Taliban? Imagine the absolute hysteria that then ensued. The lefty liberals, of course, all doing exactly what he suggested they were wrong in doing in the first place. They'd like to see him cancelled. They'd like to see him shut up. They'd like to see him not be able to make these kinds of statements. Why? Because they are the lefty liberal Taliban. 0344 499 1000. Even Jolyon Morn was having a go at him. And some MPs as well. Incredible. Absolutely remarkable. Peter's here. We'll get his views on Tony Blair and his pronouncements about why Joe Biden's behaviour is imbecilic. Pretty good coming from him. Also, of course, we will be moving on to take some more of your calls, so do keep them coming. 0344 499 1000. We'll be talking to Harry Phone from the Taxpayers Alliance as well, because believe it or not, local councils are ripping you off to the tune of £1.76 billion a year. That's just for the parking fines alone. Incredible stuff. 0344 499 1000. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, right here on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. Now available, of course, on television. It is Talk Radio.
The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Morning.
I see you've been suffering the slings and arrows over the course of the weekend. It still seems to be going on. You know, how dare you criticise the lefty liberals who may, in your view, have altered the direction of women's lives over the course of several decades?
Well, sure. It's an interesting illustration. There are more ways of controlling people's ideas and the way they behave than waving a Kalashnikov about and putting on a turban. And when I used the expression liberal Taliban, I was trying to draw attention to the fact that there is a very strong faction of people who get extremely annoyed if anybody suggests anything wrong with their long-standing policy. Immediately, I was accused of being against women being free to go out and work. It's a complete twaddle. I have no objections to that. I keep saying, if you'd like to read Virginia Woolf's wonderful short essay, A Room of One's Own, a very strong, proper feminist manifesto, then you will find everything in there I agree with about the rights of women being absolute. The problem that this country faces is that there is a faction which believes that women should be deprived of the ability to stay at home and raise the next generation. Perhaps the most honourable and important task anybody ever does in their lives. And instead they should be compelled by economic and social pressure to go out to work in call centres and other unsatisfying places while their children spend their days being looked after by paid strangers in supposed childcare. The only form of childcare which the government in this country does not subsidise is the one where you do it yourself.
Yes.
Any other form, the taxpayer is squeezed to help pay for. But the way in which children are brought up by their own parents is the one both the government and our society disapprove of. There have been decades of propaganda in women's magazines, television programmes, the BBC, the Academy, wherever you care to look, basically suggesting that the whole task of bringing up children is beneath the dignity of women, and they'd be much better off, as I say, going to a call centre and working there and being wage slaves under the total thumb of ruthless employers who pay them very little for doing quite a bit. I don't see how this is a liberation. And I get very angry when people tell me that when I criticise it that I'm in some way trying to restrict the rights and freedoms of women. It's a complete lie. But that's an example of the sort of reaction that you get when you try to discuss any serious major issue. Do people really, I mean, the people who find that they cannot conceivably raise a family without two incomes and then have to face the implications of this in paying for this childcare that they have to have, Do they really think that that their children are better off being brought up by paid strangers? The other thing is, I'm against easy divorce. I think that divorce should not be a thing that people turn to as soon as a marriage gets into difficulty, because this produces fatherless families and fatherless children, which is disastrous. Is there anybody here who thinks there is actually not enough divorce in our society? Is anybody who's experienced it or experienced others undergoing it, particularly the children of divorces, who actually wants there to be more of it? So is it not a reasonable thing to raise the question? And yet this liberal Taliban get totally enraged and puce in the face and spew out the most extraordinary excremental insults to anybody who suggests that this might not have been the most perfect policy ever devised by man. But rather than using Kalashnikovs, they use abuse, and they use denial of platform.
Yes.
And in the end, they would much rather I was dead, and if not dead, then at least silent.
At least silent. Well, exactly. Well, because some of them, I mean, it's good that you raised the divorce question, because many of them were suggesting, oh, I suppose Peter doesn't want women to get divorced then. You know, as if you were somehow trying to deny them the right to do anything, which you weren't doing.
Well, absolutely not. I've never suggested any such thing. People have been telling lies about me this kind ever since I published my book, The Abolition of Britain, which explains the extraordinary position in this country about divorce. Back in 1999, they've accused me of wanting to persecute single mothers and all kinds of other tripe and bilge that people come up with. I wouldn't dream of wanting to do any such thing. What I would like, I think, is for there to be fewer single mothers, but the idea that the women in that position have, in many cases, chosen the position they're in, or that it's their own fault, is ridiculous. The immense social pressures in this country against the family arrangements which we used to have until really about the mid-60s is colossal. And all right, for a lot of very rich careerist people of both sexes, it's turned out fine. Not least because they can all afford servants, thanks to other changes in our society. But it's not fine for most people, and for a lot of people, it's very hard graft, and it's actually a huge wrench, and they don't necessarily like it. And I think if they had some kind of political and media advocacy saying, actually, this isn't necessarily the best way of arranging a society, a lot of people would be grateful. But we can't even debate it rationally. I can't get a rational response from those who are in favour of it. That's why I call them the Taliban. The Taliban don't respond rationally to criticism either. They respond with a Kalashnikov.
No, exactly right.
And a shower of stones.
Yes. I mean, exactly right. I mean, the weekend for all of that madness was personified for me in a different actual subject, but the same idea. And this was Stephen Fry, who put out a video on behalf of Extinction Rebellion, telling everybody how we should support them, how they're not really horrible, nasty, grubby people that try and stop ordinary people from going to work every day, and that we should demand from the government the impossible. He said without any irony, sitting in a very, very well upholstered sort of library in his home in Piccadilly, where he also has a garaged Bentley. Yes.
Well, I have come to suspect that the endorsement of Stephen Fry for any cause will do it nothing but harm. So let us hope that is true.
Yes, I think so.
I am completely baffled at the way in which people admire this rather strange person. But I really can't see that his endorsement is going to help. But again, on the whole Extinction Rebellion campaign and everything else, yet another of our coal-fired power stations bit the dust yesterday. They don't just close them, they blow them up to make sure they can never be used again. While this goes on, China builds power stations, far more than we ever had, coal-fired power stations, at an increasing rate, consuming vast quantities of coal, dug out of the Inner Mongolian coalfield, which is one of the biggest ever to be found in the world, and they're going to carry on doing it for decades to come. So each time we shut down a coal-fired power station, make ourselves more vulnerable to power cuts as we do, we make absolutely no difference to the amount of coal-fired power being generated, because it carries on going up. And yet, this, again, you can't raise this, you can't say this without a stream of abuse. Nobody will respond rationally to this point.
And also, we've now also, as often is the case, it's happened with COVID. It now happens with climate change, that the creative accountants start to get involved and go, hang on a minute. Now you might have exported all of your industry to China. Therefore, any industry in China which makes goods which we buy should be counted as our emissions. And you're kind of going, this is a kind of a madness going on, isn't it?
Well, It is, but the thing about it is that it is impossible to engage with it rationally. You cannot do so. You're simply overwhelmed if you raise any objection to it and misrepresented. People will then claim that you've said something that you have not said, and will accuse you of holding opinions you do not hold. Right. And if that doesn't work, then they'll just make sure that the number of opportunities you have to make the case diminish until you vanish. And this is not done by secret police coming and hammering on the door and dragging you off to a gulag or a concentration camp. It's just done by methods which nobody can really object to or protest about, because they are, say, it's marshmallow totalitarianism. It has the same ultimate effect. You can't say it, nobody can hear it, the debate cannot be held. But because it's not done by these methods, no one will object to it. And also, it's done by the salami slicing technique. Each removal of freedom of speech is so small that no one can really be got together to protest about it at the time. But when they've all accumulated together, you've lost the entire sausage.
Absolutely right. And I see as well that the Extinction Rebellion crowd are going to be operating, as they call it, for the next 2 weeks in London, where I dare say the police may or may not arrest one or two of them. But don't worry, because when they go to court, the judge may find them guilty, or a jury may find them guilty, but they'll let them off, as they have done in the past, on the grounds that they're doing it for a good cause.
Well, maybe. Let's see.
That's happened before.
Very peculiar things have happened before, and the enforcement of the law in such matters is increasingly odd, as so many things are. But that is the society in which we live. Power does not rest where people think it rests anymore, and the possibility of questioning things through the law is much diminished, and the courts themselves are influenced by the politics of the country in which they live, unsurprisingly. But again, there won't be setting up people's courts in which it's openly stated that the courts are political. They will just become gradually more and more politicized against certain things and in favor of others, and there we will be.
Yes.
What's going on?
Speaking of the Taliban, what did you make of Tony Blair's pronouncements at the weekend, in which he declared Joe Biden to be imbecilic, or to his decision to be imbecilic, even though I had great respect for him as a man, obviously. But a lot of people saying, well, hang on a minute, this is the same man who sent British troops into Iraq without proper equipment.
Well, I think what sums up the problem of Mr. Blair is that he still feels able to speak publicly on major matters. I mean, if he actually understood what he had done and what a failure and disaster it had been, particularly the Iraq War, but there are other things as well, then he would long ago have taken himself to a Trappist monastery with a vow of silence and spent the rest of his life doing penitential things. The fact that he doesn't do that shows that he has absolutely no self-knowledge at all. He doesn't understand why people despise him, which is maybe a good thing from his own point of view. That I do think it really would be more dignified if he would show some sign, at least, of having made an error. But for him to accuse Joe Biden of making imbecilic statements and following imbecilic slogans, it's beyond parody. And what is amazing is that when he does this, people take it seriously. And there's another thing. You see, there's still quite a lot of Blairites in the media and in politics who long for this person to return to prominence.
Oh, absolutely. And they think that we are somehow worse off without him.
Yes, they do. And here we are. Though, of course, Blairism long ago fanned out into the Conservative Party and has its practitioners in the Conservative Party and in large parts of the country where people are not even aware that they are mouthing Blairite slogans in politics. This is another of the problems. People adopt all this stuff quietly. People who 20 years ago would have spoken and thought completely differently, and now they open their mouths and out comes Blairism. Because bit by bit, as the debate narrows, the number of things it's possible to say diminishes, and here you are.
And do you mourn in some way, Peter, as some others have said at the recent days, that British influence in the world is now pretty much at rock bottom, whether or not Joe Biden talks to Boris Johnson notwithstanding? You know, Britain doesn't appear to have much power anymore in any real sense.
Well, we lost our power because we made fools of ourselves and we abused it. I mean, the most significant thing we did was enter the extraordinary Russo-German War of 1914, in which we had no interest at all, bankrupted ourselves within a year, and ceased almost immediately to be a significant power, and that was the end of it. So it's a bit late to mourn it. I mean, as I was growing up, I became more and more aware that we were a diminishing country. I remember around about this time of year in 1960 watching the towing to the breakers yards of the last of the Royal Navy's battleships, HMS Vanguard, as an extraordinary sight. Not least because she got stuck in the mud being towed out of Portsmouth Harbour. But I realized at that point that I was living in a declining country, and one that was declining quite fast. In a way, of course, one could take George Santayana's, the great Spanish-American philosopher's view that the world never had sweeter masters than the British Empire. But on the other hand, all empires are bad news for the people who are under their thumbs, and it's idle to pretend that's not so. I think ours was a good deal better than, for instance, the Soviet Empire, or the growing Chinese Empire we now have, or several other empires I can think of, the Austro-Hungarian, for instance. But it was an empire. It's gone. There's not much point in regretting it. What I am extraordinarily astonished by is the huge enthusiasm for sort of modern liberal imperialism among so many people now, who seem to think that we have both the power and the right to remain in Afghanistan, and should do so, to make that country behave as we think it ought to, and to have the internal policies we think it ought to. Well, surely, I mean, the whole of my growing up period, I was told, well, it's all very well complaining about the post-colonial administrations in, say, Africa, but they have a right to their own freedom. They should be able to run their own affairs. Surely self-determination stands above all things, and that was the classic liberal left view of the colonial freedom movements of the time. Well, now we seem to have gone back on that. And do we or do we not believe that countries should determine their own internal affairs when they're independent? If we do, then we must leave them to fulfill their own destinies. If we don't, then is imperialism now okay again? I can't get the thinking of these people straight.
No, well, neither can they, funnily enough. Peter, stay with us for a moment. Well, I'm going to talk to you about a new report that's been done by an economist about whether lockdowns were worth it. We'll talk about that coming up next with Peter Hitchens.
Independent Republic of Mike Graham on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham right here on Talk Radio. We're talking to Peter Hitchens from the Mail on Sunday. Peter, I don't know whether you've seen something that Toby Young put out earlier on today on the dailyskeptic.org, and it's a cost-benefit analysis that finds that, guess what, the lockdowns were not worth it. And this is from an unpublished paper by an economic consultant called Jan Reid, who's basically sort of tried to work it out on the cost-benefit analysis of the loss of life. And he's found out effectively that the costs were up to 10 times greater than the benefits.
Yeah, and the difficulty with anything of this kind is that people will immediately turn around and say, "Well, how much is a life worth? Are you just saying that we should have lost more lives to save money?" Which was never the position which I took, and never a position I advocated, nor one in which I wish to be now back into now. I think that the analysis really needs to be made is one which shows, which I think it would if it were seriously tackled, that we actually cost more lives by doing these things than we saved. That it wasn't a matter of life versus money, but a matter of life versus life, and that the mistakes that were made did so much damage to our society, particularly to the previously healthy old, confined in their homes, deprived of activity and human contact, but also, of course, to the health service itself, which we were supposed to be saving, that we paid a very heavy toll in sickness and unhappiness and death for probably not saving very many lives. Again, it's difficult to have this argument until we've resolved the question of whether lockdowns actually did have any effect on life-saving anyway, which I think is extremely disputable if you look at the thing worldwide. I welcome any discussion of this where people would only look at it rationally and say, well, was it worth it? I still say it was totally out of proportion. You know my standard comparison, like a man burning down his house to get rid of a wasp nest. Yeah. I still think that's true. I hope this adds to the debate, but I do think people must understand that those of us who opposed the strangling of society didn't do so because we were more concerned about money than life, but because we were just as concerned about life as everybody else. We just thought it was the wrong way of saving.
Yeah. Well, when you see what's happening currently in Australia, I watched a television report last night from one of their TV networks. It's quite extraordinary what Australia is now doing to its own people. You know, they're turning up at building sites, checking people's papers to see whether or not they've signed into the right QR code. And if they haven't, they get sent home and not paid. You know, people being arrested in the street or arrested for being out at night because they've gone the wrong way or they shouldn't have been there. I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
Well, my metaphor for freedom is like a garden. Unless you constantly tend it and get rid of the weeds of authoritarianism and excessive government power, it very quickly turns into a rank mess of entangled, I won't say dictatorship, but certainly something beginning to approach tyranny. I mean, the idea that in a supposedly free country, the government can confine the population to their homes, tell them what to wear, and threaten them with heavy fines, and indeed visit quite severe police violence on them if they dare to disobey. Yeah. It's quite astonishing to me. You would expect this, as I said, in Belarus.
Well, right. And I mean, when you
Belarus
see...
is poor, but we get very, very worked up about Lukashenko's Belarus, and quite rightly so. It's a horrible tyranny. I've been there. I've seen it. But it's that we really should think a little bit more critically about our own arrangements. If a country such as Australia can descend into these measures, then we seem to have lost, again, both a sense of proportion and an understanding of what makes us free.
And Jacinda Ardern, who was being sort of hailed as the world's greatest leader ever some months back, has now actually issued a statement, which I heard her say, so I know she did say it, don't talk to your neighbours. I mean, that was actually part of a government press conference.
I have to cast doubt on that. Surely she couldn't have gone that far.
She did. She said, "Do not talk to your neighbours." I mean, I couldn't believe my ears because
she is more Blair than Blair in some ways.
Yeah.
So beloved, of course, by Blairite persons. But I'll have to check that one out.
Well, please do. But you'll find that
it's very sad. I finally made it to New Zealand a few years ago. I thought it was a beautiful and enjoyable country, and I've been watching with considerable distress what's been happening to it in the past couple of years. But it is again, this is what happens once you give too much power to people. And you give power to people, always you give power to people because they promise to do good with it. That's the start of all the problems.
Yeah, well, you entrust them to do good with it, but then when they don't, you then sort of seem surprised. But we shouldn't be, I suppose. But one other thing that I found interesting last week is Julie Hartley-Brewer actually made a very apposite point when people were moaning and groaning about how the Taliban were seeking to prevent people leaving the country because they were frightened of being killed. She said we should remind each other that actually a few months ago you could be fined £5,000 for trying to leave this country.
Yeah, I know, but it's a neat point, but it's not really an accurate comparison, is it? Most of the people of Afghanistan can't leave Afghanistan, whatever happens. Anyway, they haven't got the money or the resources to do it. And only a minority who can afford either to leave legally, as people are doing now, or via people smugglers, as people have been doing now for many years, since the first destabilizations of Afghanistan decades ago. Most people are stuck where they are, and they simply don't know what the outside world is like or how to get there. So that's very different from an advanced country like this, where freedom of movement and an annual foreign holiday, if not universal, are very common.
Yeah.
Yeah,
they used to be.
It's a smart point, but I think it's not really the point.
No, quite. Let me finish up with Afghanistan, Peter. How do you see it all kind of ending? I don't know that it's going to end anytime soon, but it doesn't look like it's going to end very well.
Well, I think for me, it's a matter of prayer and hope. I hope that they will end up at least having some peace, because peace is the beginning of all civilized life. I think the long years when it's been constant conflict, if they can only come to an end, the idea of there being another civil war, which I heard being touted this morning on the BBC, is particularly horrifying. I think the less people mess around with other people's countries, the more likely they are to find their own, if not happiness, then at least contentment and peace. I'm very much against messing around in other people's countries, just as I'm against other people's countries messing around in my own. I think this is a sensible principle. We adopted it in Europe after the 30 Years' War at the Great Peace of Westphalia. Basically, interfering in other people's countries for their own good had left Europe a great mass of ruins and ashes and corpses, And people decided that although the intentions had been good, it had been a bad idea. And that actually persisted roughly until Blair himself made his stupid famous speech in Chicago, in which he licensed for nations to intervene in other people's countries when they felt it was good. And we went back to the pre-30 Years' War rule, where you could mess around elsewhere. I think we should stop it. I think other people should stop messing around with us. We should stop messing around with them. In the end, it will be better if we stick to that rule. I know there are sometimes moments when you feel that you must intervene, but how many of these interventions after 20 or 30 years turns out to have been as good even as it looked at the time?
Well, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any one at all, Peter, but thank you very much indeed, as ever. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist, of course, speaking lots of sense during the course of that particular conversation. We'll have that, of course, out for you on YouTube and out for you on Twitter as well, because that's what we do here at Talk Radio TV. We are the original, we are the best, except no substitutes whatsoever. It'll do you no good whatever. Let's get some news headlines.